Hoje nós temos o prazer de receber o Dr. Ashley Scott, que é da Universidade de Laurentian, no Canadá. O título da sua apresentação vai ser Bioprospecting in Canada to Enhance Sustainability and Fight Antioxidant, Antibacterial and Anticancer Compounds. Eu convido a pesquisadora da Fiocruz, doutora Clarissa Gurgel, para apresentar o Dr. Ashley, que é um convidado dela.
Thank you, everyone. Now, I'm going to turn in English now, okay? Just to present Dr. Ashley, and just a brief presentation. Dr. Ashley Scott is a professor in bioprocessing engineer in Laurentian University. He leads projects on bioprospecting and development of bioproducts with application in health. He's currently the director at OnGene, a multidisciplinary research and development group linked to the Laurentian University, which seeks to create new business opportunities for sustainable development, linking industry, research institution, and government agencies in the reuse of regional resources. Then it's a pleasure to have you here with us, Ashley. Then thank you for this opportunity with you.
Thank you very much, Clarissa, and indeed thank you to all your colleagues as well. This is my privilege to have my third visit to Fiocruz, and it's been a real pleasure in meeting so many people, and also, to be fair, seeing such an amazing research institution. I'm not sure we have the same in Canada. I think ours are more disparate and more broken up, so it's rather nice to see a very coordinated facility. Perhaps most exciting for us is the opportunity to collaborate, and we'll talk about that right, or at least highlight that right at the end. So I'm going to give a very brief presentation. It's just an overview. What we're trying to do is entice people to collaborate with us and see opportunity. And we both know that Canada and Brazil are enormous countries. And I was just mentioning, although Canada on paper is a larger country, in fact, there's more land in Brazil simply because Canada is made up of lakes. We have a phenomenal number of lakes, and we'll talk about that briefly. And so our opportunity is very much exploiting these lakes in a positive way, particularly our freshwater resources, not just as drinking, but also those things that live in it. So that's where we came from. But our original driver, before we started looking at disease-fighting compounds and things of that like, was actually in more practical process engineering applications of resources. But after 10 years or a few years of doing that, we realized there's a huge opportunity for the natural resources of Canada and its potential for utilization, particularly for fighting many of the problematic diseases we have in our society today. So, okay. So anyway, thank you. So first off, that is actually Laurentian University at the bottom there, where we have our facility. As you can see, there's water. And I keep mentioning water, and it's going to come up more than once. We have a lot of it, particularly fresh water. We also have the longest coastline in the world, but we're way inside, as you see shortly. We're not in the middle of Canada, so a long way from the coast. So all the focus of our work is with fresh water and indeed things that grow near it. So rather than moving on, this is actually a very brief summary of what we currently do in OnGen. There are quite a lot of us. We're not all working on disease-fighting compounds. We also do some more pragmatic process engineering type work as well. But for today, I'm just going to focus in on the top few, not necessarily going to cover all of it, but in particular the utilization of microalgae and their opportunities therein. Most of us are aware of microalgae, and if you've not worked with it, it gives a green tinge to the natural water bodies. But I have to be honest, until I started working with them, had nothing to do with them other than cleaning out of a swimming pool, just being a nuisance. Most of my work historically has been with bacteria and yeasts. So my introduction to microalgae is relatively recent. But since we've been involved with them, I think they're amazing. I think they're the most underutilized biological resource on the planet. They have so much capability, much above and beyond bacteria, and even yeasts and fungi and so on. They basically are an amazing plant, and they produce some extraordinary biochemicals. So I'm going to focus today very briefly, not going to cover everything on that short list at the top, but a very brief overview of what we're up to. Just no project would be appropriate without at least acknowledging the people who actually do the work. So this is a list. Forgive me for those who I've forgotten, but this is the current list I put together very quickly of those that are actively working with us. Now, there are many people peripheral as well to that who are equally important to our work, but this is the ones core based physically at our facility, if you want. So I thought it's better. I know that a lot of you have been to Canada or familiar with it. So those who have, this is going to be repetition, but I thought I at least should show you where Sudbury is and where we are in location to Canada. You can see way down there. It doesn't look very far from the ocean, but we're an awful long way from the ocean. We're not that far from the US border in terms of Canadian distances. And if you take Ontario, which is the province that we're in, you can see that we're actually about 400 kilometers, 375 kilometers north of Toronto. But you can see there that whilst we have a fraction of the people that Toronto has, we have an enormous amount of land. I believe it's certainly the biggest municipality in Canada, not by population, simply by the amount of land that it occupies. And within Sudbury, keep talking about water, we have 300 lakes. And when I say lakes, I mean real lakes, not little puddles, just within Sudbury itself. So this is what most people think of Canada, I discovered in my trips to Brazil, and it's not far off for probably 6 months of the year, to be fair. That one on the left there actually took in December, so the snow came a little early, frustratingly this year. So that actually it took soon before I came to Salvador at the end of December last year, beginning of January this year. So that was taken, and the two pictures feature actually me and Corey are in that picture. That's on the lake, which is I'm privileged to live on. And you can see walk, and indeed, if you look on the right-hand picture, you'll see people driving a truck across the lake in January. So, and that lake, you could drive trucks across for 3 or 4 months of the year. I mean, substantial vehicles. However, and it's minus 34. In fact, the coldest day I remember is minus 40. That was, and then when you add the wind into it, it's quite entertaining. However, thankfully, you also get warm. And the same lake in June and July, and it's quite different. And that's what makes this big difference between Brazil and ourselves. We have similar land, we have similar economies, mining, agriculture, tourism, manufacturing. We have similar contributions from First Nations or indigenous populations. But nevertheless, the big difference, and we have obviously a vast array of ecosystems, but the big difference between Canada and Brazil, and that's where I hope there's opportunity for us to collaborate, is our temperature range. And 70-degree temperature range in one location throughout the year is not unusual. And that's, it amazes me how nature copes and how every year the leaves will be out and the flowers will be out and everything as if it was just full-time summer. When I left, it looked like the picture up there. And when I get back, it's going to look a bit like that in the space of about 5 or 6 weeks. It's going to be quite spectacular. Anyway, this is what our focus is for today and what our predominant focus is on, Jen. So we do other things as well that aren't strictly microbiological or biological in nature. And we're particularly interested in them. And actually, the original interest was not, as I said, for their disease-fighting properties, but the fact that they consume carbon dioxide. And our first work, and indeed what we got a reasonable amount of funding from, particularly from the mining industry, was to actually look at mitigating or reducing greenhouse gas emissions, in particular carbon dioxide. They generate a lot for processing ore, and they were looking for alternative ways of capturing or reusing the CO2. And because algae take about 1.8 kilograms of CO2 for every kilogram of biomass, that's dry weight, of course, that's quite a high consumption. And of course, at the same time, not only are you consuming CO2, but you're generating what is hopefully useful biomass that you can then exploit for other purposes. And so this is the list of things we do, but the top one, biofuels, was actually what started our work. We had no interest and no knowledge of nutrients or disease-fighting chemicals when we first started this work. It was exclusively to try and capture carbon dioxide from industry and basically mitigate it. Now, Canada, I'm not sure about Brazil, but Canada does now have a carbon tax on gases of CO2 emitted or CO2 equivalent. So there's quite a lot of interest now in capturing CO2. May not be about the planet and saving the planet. It's maybe just about saving money, but nevertheless, for whatever reason, industry is paying attention hugely in Canada in ways of possibly capturing and not emitting their carbon dioxide emissions. So this is where we first started all our work, and this is an ore smelter. It's nickel ore. In Sudbury, we have two large smelters. The other one is owned by Vale, so obviously a close Brazilian connection there. And this is the one by Glencore. And I mentioned Glencore, or the mining industry. It's Glencore, a large mining organization. They're not familiar with it. They're not particularly large in Brazil, but they're certainly international. And they're the ones who've been very generous to us in supporting our work and continue to support our work very significantly. Anyway, the interest here was capturing that CO2 coming from the stack there you can see on the right. You'll see shortly, they generate around about 100,000 tons per annum. So it's not large, it's not enormous. There are many more bigger emitters, but certainly in our region, it is quite substantial. And this was basically the concept. We put a pilot plant, I believe still the only one in the world, directly taking CO2 from a smelter into tanks of algae. It looks a bit worn and battered, but this is 7 floors up, 7 stories up on the roof. And you can imagine the conditions are pretty brutal, particularly again in the winter, where the temperatures, of course, can be -30 or lower, and the wind is significant up there. But we are actually pumping in a small portion of the CO, of the off gas direct from the smelter into our tanks of algae. So we actually have real results. Now that will become quite relevant very shortly, the problems we also face with doing this. However, the concept, and it's probably fairly familiar, is to have algae ponds and actually feed them with CO2 and also heat. Remember, we are in winter, we are in Canada, so we don't have the privilege of growing algae all year round, you know, in the open environment. We can have ice covering lakes for up to 6 months, typically 4 or 5, where we are. And of course, temperature conditions are not conducive to algae growth. So another attraction for the smelter was an enormous amount of heat that they generate that they do not utilize. The smelter in total probably generates about 160 megawatts of heat, and not 1 watt is captured, reused, or repurposed. It's all dissipated into the environment. So we thought, well, sure, we can capture some of that and help us grow algae throughout the year. Plus, the other part of the project was that all the CO2 that didn't get captured by the algae would feed into greenhouses, and that would help grow saplings, trees, which are being used for rehabilitation of mine land. So it'd be a complete package. And of course, the potential would be, we'd hope, that all the CO2 would be captured. But that's probably unrealistic, but if we can capture some of the carbon dioxide, that's certainly a big plus. So just going back, those are probably familiar with it, that lipids are what we're targeting in algae. If you want to produce biofuel, basically you can transesterify them into biodiesel. It's the same process if you're taking used cooking oils or fats from restaurants, or even using things like rapeseed oil or canola to turn into biodiesel. Basically exactly the same concept. And it's quite an efficient way of producing the fuel. It's a very simple process. It's easily done. You can literally do it in your backyard if you're so inclined. I went to West Virginia once in the US, and a guy was literally collecting oils from local restaurants and was making biodiesel for his Volkswagen, as it was, in his backyard, literally, and quite successfully running his vehicle from homemade biodiesel. If you actually look at the smelter, the potential for biodiesel, in terms of using microalgae to capture the carbon dioxide, the emissions are about 100,000 tons. And from that, you could produce well over 1 million liters of biodiesel if you only captured 10%. In other words, 10,000 tons per annum. You'd still generate almost, well, 1.5, 1.6 million liters of diesel, or produce 1.6 million liters of biodiesel, simply by capturing 10% of their emissions with algae. Now that, you know, it's not, to be honest, it seems like a large number, but in the scheme of things, the fuel consumption is huge. However, there's a very ready market locally, and that's underground mining, which uses fossil fuel diesel. and it's very noxious. It needs a lot of extraction, air extraction to protect people. So if you could substitute fossil fuel diesel with biodiesel, you'd have a much cleaner working environment underground. And that was a big attraction to Glencore and other mining companies. However, moving on to what we really wanted to talk about, which is the other aspects of microalgae, whilst we still do this work, we got, to be honest with you, most of us got much more excited about the other opportunities with algae, and particularly some of the biocompounds that they generate naturally. However, just before I do that, just a little fun thing that we do use this quite a lot, particularly for small operations, not necessarily the scale of the smelter. We actually work with small businesses as well that generate carbon dioxide, and I'll refer to that briefly later on. But the smelter site is around 58 hectares. The actual overall site is around 10,000 hectares, but the actual sort of area where the smelting takes place is around 58. And if you actually wanted to pretend that was covered by trees, rather than car parks and buildings and other certain service yards, you would actually have to capture only about 0.6% of the smelter's output with algae, because algae are plants, so they generate oxygen during the day. And so you could actually say, if we captured only 0.6% of the smelter's 100,000 tons per annum, we'd generate enough oxygen as if that whole area was covered with trees. Now, I know it's not key, but it's rather a fun thing to promote to small businesses who want to get involved in this, because they like the idea, I don't know, quite rightly, that their car parks and their buildings are actually forests, because we're generating enough oxygen by capturing our carbon dioxide to pretend that we're all covered with trees. Just a kind of a side issue that we promote quite a lot. However, this is the big problem. I mentioned it before. If you're bubbling carbon dioxide into water, it's going to go acidic. Not hugely acidic because of CO2 turns into carbonic acid. However, most industrial off-gases also contain other trace elements like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. Much more acidic gas, much more stronger acids when they dissolve. And basically, it makes it very difficult. Everybody around the world is trying to capture, or not everybody, but there are many projects around the world trying to use industrial CO2 using microalgae, or try and consume industrial CO2 using microalgae. But the problem that everybody ignores is that it goes acidic. As soon as you start bubbling in these off gases, the water becomes very acidic, and the algae that most people are using really need to be at pH 6 or pH 7. So the acidic conditions, in fact, when we blow in the gas in the smelter, it drops to below pH 3 without doing anything. You know, within a few minutes, you've got pH 2.8, 2.9. And that's a real issue. And this led us on, and this is what came what we thought, oh dear, our project's not going to work, quite frankly, because we didn't want to have to shovel in tons of alkali or just periodically blow in CO2 just 2 or 3 hours a day. The pH would drop and then let it recover again and blow in more CO2, or neither of which is particularly attractive economically. And this led to this sort of problem, actually led to the discoveries that I'll finish off talking about today. We decided, and we thought, hang on, maybe we can find algae that actually thrive at low pH, rather than pH 6 or pH 7, which is the traditional range of most algae, microalgae and water bodies. So we started bioprospecting. There's a helicopter there because we were lucky enough, we had enough money at the time, not anymore, to actually hire helicopters. And at $2,000 an hour, these things are not cheap. But it did give us a unique opportunity to sample a huge area very, very efficiently. Now, we made a lot of mistakes. We sampled over 400 odd water bodies, closer to 500 or 600 now, probably. And probably, to be honest, 95% of those didn't generate anything of particular interest, scientific interest. Algae, sure, but not really any practical value. And perhaps most importantly, would not survive at low pH. So this is our target. And what we actually found, this is ironic when we're actually working with the mining industry, is water bodies associated with mining, particularly abandoned mining, ones that have been abandoned 60, 70 years ago. Because 60, 70 years ago, people really didn't care about the environment, sadly. So they walked, a mine was built and then they walked away from it. There was no rehabilitation, no protection at all. And so the pH of many of these water bodies are very low. And you can see that picture on the bottom right there. That's actually an old gold mine. It has a particular interest to me because it happens to be at the end of the lake I live on by coincidence. That mine's been abandoned for probably 70 or 80 years, and still the pH is 2.6. But that green stuff is actually algae that are thriving in that very low pH. Of course, they've taken many years, decades to acclimatize to this very low pH, but they have very successfully. That's unique, almost unique. I know that it's a real extremophile. It's not just this. We've sampled other water bodies associated with mining that have low pH, and they've also generated very interesting microalgae. And of course, remember that the pH drops to 3 and blowing in CO2. So now we have algae that would thrive in those conditions of low pH. But they do much more than that, way more than that. So if you actually take this example, here is the same mining site, just a little picture of it, and you can see it grows, and I think the visual there, the two Cenodesmus dimorphus and Chlorella vulgaris are the classic microalgae grown in labs around the world, not just for biodiesel production, but also potentially for nutraceuticals or nutraceutical type compounds. And you can see that they both die out really at pH 3 and in some cases even higher. But our bioprospective ones, not only do they not die out at pH 3, which is the pH that we're looking for if we're going to bubble in carbon dioxide, they thrive at all pHs. Remarkable. We had no expecting. We thought they would die out at higher pHs. They're acclimatized to pH 2.6 in this case. Why are they surviving even at 6 and 7, as well as the culture collection species? And so that was really quite of great interest. However, it's all very well if they survive at that low pH, but do they produce anything of interest? Growing is one thing, but they also got to produce something of value as well. Now, the value could be just capturing carbon dioxide, but we wanted to go beyond just capturing carbon dioxide. We also wanted products of value to make it even more attractive to industry to capture their CO2 and generate products that they can utilize. So going back to this is where we moved on to the second half of the potential for a microalgae. Well, I'm going to very, very briefly go over in the next 4 or 5 slides, and that'll be the end of the presentation. So I'd like to obviously engender interest from you guys, really. So nutrients, sure. Lipids, well, we all know that they also, of course, polyunsaturated fatty acids or omega-3s, omega-6s, and so on. Great interest, and I'll be looking at those shortly. But also disease fighting. Well, okay, if these algae are thriving or surviving, let's put it a better way, these low pHs, they must have defense mechanisms to allow them to cope, secondary metabolites that generated to try and adjust to those peculiar or very stressful conditions. Remember, it's not just pH 2.6, it's also minus 30 in the winter. You know, it's not just the pH they're coping with, they're also coping, but it's also plus 30 in the summer. So they're coping with a wide range of temperatures. And it's also not just pH 2.6, there are also metals in there, higher concentrations of metals that would not normally exist. So they're really having to fight to survive. And so we thought, well, okay, maybe they'll produce something that's useful for disease fighting and protective secondary metabolites. So back to our smelter. Yeah, it's a great source of CO2, over 100,000 tons per annum. But probably we're going to grow microalgae that we want for disease fighting purposes or health beneficial purposes, probably not the greatest source of CO2 because it is dirty carbon dioxide. It's not just carbon dioxide, it's got sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, fine metal particles, dust particles, all range of other perhaps less attractive components. Particularly we want to generate microalgal compounds that are free of contaminants. This would be the worst possible target to consume CO2. Yes, you could clean the contaminants out, but at a huge cost. So yes, you can produce biodiesel easily, that'd be not a problem. But if you want to put it inside your body, maybe most people would be a little skeptical. This is a great source of carbon dioxide. So I mentioned small. And so what we've now moved on to the other side, we've been looking at fermentation, food grade carbon dioxide from beverages and producing bread and so on. Small scale, compared to the industry, but very clean carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide actually is literally food grade CO2. It's free of all those other contaminants. There's no sulfur dioxide, there's no nitrogen dioxide, there's certainly no metal particles or dust particles in it. And you can see from that, by simply bubbling through fermentation, and this is, we repeated this many times, this is just one of many, many, you can see the huge increase in biomass just after a couple of weeks from actually putting CO2, this food grade CO2, through tanks of algae. And these are the algae that we bioprospected from those mine sites that survive at low pH. And is the low pH survival capability important? Well, it certainly is, because we also tried traditional algae, but ones that most research organizations use, like the culture collections I referred to before, and also even some of our own bioprospected algae, which we thought would survive. And we put them in the same conditions, and basically they just died. They pooched out after less than a day. So those algae bioprospect from industrial sites. Now, I will say right at the beginning, not every algae from an industrial site or even a low pH site is ideal. We've narrowed it down to a few great candidates. However, you can see from that graph alone, unless we put in lots of alkali or reduce the level of CO2 exposure, most algae will not survive with this food-grade clean carbon dioxide. So just to emphasize, that's typical percentage of lipid after 3 weeks of growth in this particular example. So around 17.5% of dry weight is lipid, and total lipid. But if we actually stress them, in other words, we put them under some sort of environmental stress, in our case, temperature and pH, you can see an enormous increase in lipid production. Just emphasizing that those environmental stresses that these organisms are under really generates things of use. Added to which, that can be controlled stress. So you could grow algae large quantities of biomass and then over a week, deliberately impose a stress on them to really get those secondary metabolites built up. And of course, for us, exactly the same shot, and I'll be very proud of it. It's a shot from my house. You can see winter and summer pretty well exactly the same. And that side of it, and to us, of course, for us in Canada, the easiest stress in the world is to use temperature, particularly for most of the year. We can operate at a higher temperature and just switch the heating off, and the stress will happen naturally, if you like. There are other ways of stressing. We look at UV, and we use pH, which I mentioned there, some other ways of stressing them, but temperature is a very simple one. And just to show, remember, we're after not fuel now, not biodiesel lipids. We're looking for health beneficial lipids, or PUFAs, for example. From our work, we drop the temperatures 5 degrees. We actually increase, not only do we increase the total quantity of lipid, we also contribute what percentage of it is a PUFA. If you drop it down to -4, almost 50% of the lipid is now predominantly polyunsaturated. Well, it is polyunsaturated fatty acids, so it has potential health benefits. And remember, we're using clean food-grade carbon dioxide to generate these algae. So they are, you could literally just pop them in your mouth. They are totally, without doing anything to them, totally innocuous or safe to consume. So to conclude today, and this is probably leading to the work with Clarissa and her colleagues, is can we do some disease fight? I mean, yes, they produce, we know we produce lipids. We knew they produce lipids anyway, because that was our original target. What was nice is we can accelerate or accentuate the production of PUFAs, or polyunsaturated fatty acids, component of the lipids. But we've also started fractionating the extracts, and also just using whole extracts to see if they have health beneficial or disease fighting capabilities. And so just to finish, 2 more slides. Algae are known, this was no surprise, this is well known, are a good source of antioxidants, which carotenoids are an obvious and a very plentiful quantity. I put blackberries and blueberries. Blueberries are very big where we are. Huge. In fact, we're getting into the blueberry season. You'll see many people at the side of the road selling blueberries, and blueberries are promoted for their high levels of antioxidants. You can compare blueberry concentration to a culture collection of Acinetosimus, it's nowhere near. It's orders of magnitude lower. So they are renowned, and this is nothing new here, for their high levels of antioxidants. However, and I literally did pick these at random. These aren't particular superstars. They're just two of our special algae of a range of about 10 we have. If you actually look at the concentrations in the bioprospected algae, surprise, surprise, the antioxidant level is way higher. And considering the harsh conditions they operate or grow in, that doesn't make a lot, it makes a lot of sense. They're protecting themselves from those harsh conditions. They have extraordinarily high levels of antioxidants. And of course, what we'd like to do, and what we are doing, is comparing them to synthetic antioxidants and seeing how they perform. And they perform, as you'd expect, really well. So we can actually, because most antioxidants, the cells we all know, commercially are synthetic. So it would be nice to introduce more natural source ones, so, you know, potentially less carcinogenic. And certainly we compare with Trolox, which most of you know is a vitamin E analog, and performs extraordinarily well. Without doing anything really super refining or precise separations, just the actual extract, not even fractionating. I mentioned the previous slide, fractionation, but even the extract alone prior to fractionation generates phenomenal performance. And we also looked at it antibacterial, and yes, considering their work, you know, these are organisms in a nasty environment. It's not just protecting themselves against the conditions, physical conditions, they also protect themselves against other microorganisms, which bacteria proliferate in these, you know, extremophile bacteria are not uncommon. And so these microalgae, not all again, you know, some we thought would be effective and not. We've learnt through experience, for many years of trying and failure, find those that are successful at defending themselves against bacteria. And we've certainly got minimum inhibitory concentrations, orders of magnitude lower than anything that's been reported in the literature anywhere in the world, not just in Canada. And that includes saltwater as well, or saline algae as well as freshwater algae. It is just very, and we test them against a range of gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, and they are effective. So it's a pretty, yeah, it's an exciting development for us. They are so impactful as an antibacterial agent. However, the final slide is the one I think I'd love to, this is where I'm hoping we will collaborate very much on, is the final slide, because we took those that have a very high antibacterial performance. Again, it's not all, it's just some. And we then decided to try them against cancer cells. Now, where we are, there is actually a medical school at the Laurentian, and they have a limited range of cancer cells. So we really have been quite limited in what we could test it against, mainly ovarian and I think what's the other one? Yeah, well, breast cancer, sorry. Breast and ovarian cancer, particularly ovarian, which is, I'm sure again you know way better than I do. This is not my area of expertise, so technical questions on this you'll just get a blank look from me, I assure you. But you know, the ones that are very fast growing and therefore major targets for chemotherapy, like all fast growing cancers. So final slide. We did and have tested, and we are actually now moving into fractions. We tried originally with just a pure extract, and these results we're going to show you now a pure extract. We have now results with fractions, and so far, I will be honest, our fractions do not perform as well as the pure extract. Clearly, there's a synergistic effect. It's not just one part of the extract. There has to be more than one, which we're not clever enough yet to identify. But nevertheless, again, this may be a huge opportunity for us for collaboration. So we did an ovarian one. This is just, it's nothing complicated, just a simple photo of them, healthy ovarian cancer cells. I should also add, before I put the next slide up, we have tested them against healthy cells and no apparent impact, no statistical, no visual impact at all. Even subjectively, we felt even the healthy one seemed healthier, but that was a purely subjective, non-statistical observation. But the key thing is they do not appear to have any negative impact on healthy cells. Remember, this is the extract that has high antibacterial activity as well. And so a simple exposure to a completely different picture. We've had pictures where we've had almost complete elimination of, I've got other pictures you've probably seen before, where it's almost complete elimination of cancer cells, but the healthy cells remain of the same exposure, totally unimpacted, which to me, not being an expert in the slightest, seems to be the most exciting thing. You've got something. I mean, there's many, even, think about the antibacterial work. Great, they kill bacteria, but they do not impact human cells or healthy cells. I mean, thousands of chemicals out there will kill bacteria, but you've got to find, obviously, it's blindingly obvious. You've got to find those chemicals that do not have an adverse effect on healthy cells, and of course that limits you significantly. And again, the same hope is with application of Clarissa in particular, and others, colleagues, and Rizzi, I'm also glad to see here that we can try and exploit that. Now, I think my gut feel is we're going to be more stopping proliferation rather than killing cells. I think that's where the opportunity is to add this with other therapies as a combination, a natural additive, if you like, formulated in to actually try and stop proliferation. I hope great if it also helps contribute to destroying cancer cells. That's an added bonus, but just as a feeling, I think it's going to anti-proliferation is the most likely. And so to conclude, a brief presentation, this is where we're hoping with UFBA, and of course, in particular, Fiocruz to establish, or could be already established, but to continue the work. And so we're at the point now of actually producing extracts and then sending them here and then do the work. And indeed, in July, the person who does most of this work, does all the heavy lifting, Jerusa, who is actually from Salvador originally. She studied dentistry at Salvador and is now working with us in Canada. She'll be coming in July, hopefully working with you people, actually try our extracts and see if we have an effect. And forgive me if I got the right-hand list wrong. I probably did, so it's my best stab at something I'm not. You've got to forgive me, I'm a biochemical engineer, not a biochemist or a microbiologist, but this is what we're hoping to achieve, and of course expand. And it's not just with the microalgae I've discussed, but also other opportunities as well. And of course, one of the big things for us is to try and encourage people to come to Canada rather than me. Not that it's my 5th trip to Brazil in a year and a bit, so quite clearly it's difficult persuading me to come here. But it would be nice to persuade some of you guys to come and visit us. I appreciate you probably want to come in the summer, so you have 2 months to hit that, but nevertheless, it's worth it. It is worth it. So that's what I'd like to say, because I really wanted to use this as a way of trying to encourage people to talk with us and see if we can obviously expand the opportunities and develop the work and more importantly, the collaboration. Because as I started off, we have a lot of resources in a different way, slightly different way to Brazil. In our case, it's mainly fresh water, but also Brazil has many resources that we have, which is impacted mine site waters, for example. There's nothing to say why your waters shouldn't have the same characteristics that ours generate. Of course, you won't have the temperature range, but you'll have much of everything else. So maybe it's the temperature. We're hoping it is a temperature that makes us unique, but if it's not, no, maybe it's partially disappointing. You can do it in other countries, but nevertheless. And I will say, to finish off, that's taken over 10 years to get to this point. It wasn't just a question of going out, taking a sample, and whoopee, we've got some fantastic results. And I again will give Jerusalem and many of the other people in the team a particular shout out, 10 years of hard work to achieve what we think is quite outstanding, but opportunity for the future. So thank you very much for taking time listening.
Thank you, Ashley. I'm not sure if we start with the audience or with online, but I have a question. Yeah. Okay, then Dr. Milena.
Thank you so much for the nice presentation. It's a fantastic work. I was wondering if you thought about testing parasites because we know.
Yes,
some creating of natural compounds against chromosomal fuse and nationwide. I think you were interested in that.
Very much. In fact, a friend, colleague, but he's a neurologist, and he's stimulated the thought of looking at protozoa in the brain. So yes, that is, I didn't mention it. I mean, the other area which we sort of mentioned here briefly, but we haven't looked at, is also antifungal and antiviral. But parasites actually will be the next, I think, is the next of particular interest, particularly considering how these things protect themselves in the natural environment. Okay, they're not protecting themselves against human protozoa, but nevertheless, I think there's a real opportunity. I didn't mention it, and no big surprise that algae found growing in sewage treatment facilities have phenomenal antibacterial properties. And I imagine if they're growing in a sewage treatment facility, they also have a lot of protection against protozoa, which could graze on them, of course. So I think there's a huge opportunity. So yes,
The other screening that we're also doing is for immunomodulatory compounds.
Right.
For acting immune system. So
yep, all of that is exactly. I just think this. We can't cover any. Can't even cover a fraction of the opportunity. And I think that's the thing that kind of adds to it, is that it's a good story. Particularly mine sites, which we have obviously plenty in Brazil as around the world. It's a bad story. It's rather nice to get a good story out of these resources that have been sitting there, everybody condemning them. Yet little did we know, they were actually generating some extraordinary organisms. Unfortunate way of doing it, perhaps, but nevertheless. However, more to the point, I agree, particularly protozoa. I mean, right, absolutely something we're very interested in tackling, and it couldn't be more opportune if there's an opportunity. Stimulating the immune system, yes, that would certainly for immunotherapy would be very interesting. But stimulating as well, it would be equally. Yeah, but again, we can't do it. We certainly can't do it. Whilst there's a reasonable number of us working, there's no way we have the capability of covering the area. So.
Saying that we do this type of screening, if you will.
Brilliant.
Actually, individual activity per lab. I think it's a good opportunity. Yes. We have one question. Go ahead.
We have one question from the chat. Louise, very, very interesting results, thanks. I may have missed the information. Was the antibacterial activity tested on infected cells?
No, we haven't actually done any pathogenic cells. No, we've only taken straightforward culture collections. Is that what you're asking? So we know we have worked with the local hospital about pathogenic, but quite honestly, we just wanted, we moved on very quickly to anti-cancer. So the bacteria remains effective, but it's not something we've continued, which might seem strange, but not something we developed. Again, to be honest, it's a lack of human resources as much as anything. So that's an area that's still opportunity. So no, we've not done any clinical type studies with, if that's a question, with
collaborate.
Yeah, no, exactly. Another opportunity for us.
Students, please. I have one. But can I? Yeah. Probably in the math. So that they can hear you. Oh, yeah. Hello again, Doctor. I was wondering, were you able to test and see what type of metabolic routes the mitochondria of the microalgae are following? Because they're responsible for the antioxidant properties that we have on our body. They're the ones that naturally fight it. So would you be like interested on like looking into that?
We've done not. I know exactly what you're referring to, and no, we've not actually looked at. I know obviously that algae are source of a whole range of chemicals that, well, I mean, PUFAs is an obvious example. Omega-3s, and I know it's not antioxidant, but nevertheless, have that come from algae. But in terms of us looking at accelerating or accentuating production of antioxidants, which I think you're referring to, and how they then impact on us, no, we've not done it. I'll be honest with us, we're kind of simple engineers, most of us. So our predominant role is just to generate large-scale commercial opportunity. The fine detail, it's beyond our abilities, quite frankly. So, I'm being very unfair to many of my colleagues, and I'm being a little facetious, but we have not looked at. We were just trying to actually look at everything and then help narrow it down from then on.
We have one more question from Marco Edilson Freire. Congratulations on the brilliant conference. Your results are really very interesting. Do you have results on the chromatography profile of and/or chemical composition of the evaluated extracts?
Of the extracts?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have fractionated it out. We have a breakdown. It's not in the public domain. I have to be cautious what I'm allowed to say on that one. However, I will say that we've not identified the particular compounds. We know it's a synergistic impact. I think I referred to that. It's definitely more than one. We can narrow it down to a whole range. So no, I guess whilst I'm saying we really haven't got that much of a detailed breakdown. We certainly, and I'll be honest with you, we've yet to really identify what is the impactful components of the extract. We've got an idea, but we haven't clearly identified it yet.
But you had the intention to, or?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Oh yeah. In fact, that work is actually going to go through all this summer. In fact, what we were trying to do is, remember, an awful lot of algae did nothing. What we spent a lot of time just identifying those that did a lot, and now we're moving on to identifying components of them.
You have one more question. Yeah. From Pablo Ramos. Thanks for the exciting talk. Are you planning to further characterize the bacterial communities from which you are recovering the microalgae using metagenomics? Maybe there is some form of enhancement between bacteria versus algae?
Yeah, exactly. That's something we are doing. I mentioned earlier about algae growing in a sewage treatment facility. Clearly, there's a very clear interaction going on there. We're actually started doing that. We're trying to identify, the groups and seeing exactly who's stimulating the algae to produce defense, basically. And it's very dramatic, as you'd expect. I mean, they're growing in a soup of bacteria and protozoa. You'd assume they can't survive otherwise, and they're surviving very well. And that's what we're trying to do at the moment. We're actually with a local wastewater facility. We're actually trying to identify. And we have a colleague, she's up there, doing exactly that. I've got an answer yet. I'm not avoiding the question. We don't know the answer yet.
Someone else? I have a question. Eugenia.
Here. I just want to know if you have any collaboration here in Brazil with groups that make some prospecting similar to you.
We have no collaboration with any bioprospecting or even really large-scale production of microalgae. No, careful how I phrase this. Going to say I don't want to come over as rude, but I guess we've developed the production. We know how to make these things. Generate large quantities of them. We know how to capture carbon dioxide. We've got many companies we work with in that area. Types of company. We certainly know how to bioprospect. I think for us, the much more exciting and where we, as I mentioned, probably all through the presentation, where we lack is the next stage, is actually really exploiting these properly. I mean, exploiting in a good way, and finding out exactly the sort of question you just asked me, exactly what's causing them to be so effective. We know it's stress conditions, great, we know that, but exactly why those stress conditions or how they're affecting secondary metabolite production is so important. We know, and again, I'm very happy to collaborate with people at bioprospecting. That's certainly not, would love to do it. We'll have the opportunity to bioprospect in Brazil, but at the moment we need to, I think, we're only a limited number of people. We need to focus on the good things.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks again, Ashley, for
Welcome.
this nice talk. And then I'd like to finish this meeting. And then
Thank you.